his knowledge of medicine was all theoretical. After the debacle of the plague, medicine became increasingly more practical.
In the Italian countryside, another transformation is taking place. Prior to the plague, famine is common. Though every inch of land is sowed, supply never catches up to the soaring demand. Now, even with much of the land gone fallow, there is food to spare. For the first time in centuries, farmers can grow not just grain but luxury crops. And so, Italy becomes a country rich in olive oil and fragrant fruit.
Francesco, vieni giù ad aiutare! Non posso fare tutto da solo.
Sì, papà.
Italy's orchards underline a grisly fact. A sudden drop in population has its advantages.
As people died, wages rose. And as people died and lands were vacated, people who in the past were relatively poor could afford to begin to invest in land.
And what that meant was that all of a sudden people who had been peasants were now what we might call kulak class. They were now landowners. They had decent-sized farms and they could actually live independent lives rather than working the fields of others.
One of the interesting things is to look at the diet. Their diet, which is almost strictly grain-fed diet, ale, bread pudding, bread, now has quite a bit of meat in it, has some vegetables in it.
La cena è pronta!
Andiamo, figli.
But as the fortunes of peasants rise, the lot of the ruling class plummets. For centuries, nobles have depended on serfs to work the estates. Now, with better jobs drawing peasants elsewhere, nobles are left without a labor force, forcing them to gather their own bitter harvest. A clergyman gleefully notes how the mighty have fallen.
Churchmen, knights, and other worthies have been forced to thresh their corn, plow their land, and perform every other unskilled task if they are to make their own bread.
Ma che stai facendo? Ma come la stai usando quella zappa?
Marito mio, giuro che te la faccio mangiare
Ma
questa
guarda come
pasta.
stai zappando, se la usassi bene, non staremo qua tutto il giorno.
Many impoverished nobles refuse to lower themselves to farm work. Instead, they seek their fortune the old-fashioned way, at the point of a sword.
We had a lot of military types running around. Sometimes they're employed by France or England or Spain or Catalonia or someone, in which case they're drawing a salary and looting cities for pay. Sometimes they're unemployed and they're looting cities to feed themselves.
To make up for the shrinking size of their armies, knights create new rules for an old game. Guerrilla warfare is born, and worse.
We have all these demilitarized men roaming the land, looking for opportunities to pillage. And that's really where things like scalping, for example, come from. It was the terror tactics of these groups of military men seeking to extort from villagers and from city folk.
The repercussions of a smaller workforce ripple into the more peaceful pursuits of commerce and industry as well.
Simply, the destruction of so many people forced the survivors to come up with labor-saving devices such as the printing press.
Industries that used to rely heavily on surplus manual labor, like the cloth industry, which used to be able to count on lots of dislocated peasants who didn't have land because there were so many people and the land was fixed. They can't rely on that labor, so they start to turn to other kinds of solutions, technological solutions, like mills.
Less than a century after the Black Death, the fabulous illuminated manuscripts of the Middle Ages become relics. Gutenberg's printing press has put them out of business.
all the industries that we really associate with later processes of industrialization start to emerge in the late 14th century, and you could argue that they emerge partly as a response to the labor crisis precipitated by the plague.
Still, the greatest impact of the plague is not in the battlefields or factories, but in the human heart.
I can't even imagine the anguish that would have occurred from a parent or a child watching a parent get sick. Take young people who may have seen their parents die, surviving in the 1350s, but with that memory of death all around them, so that death became a common sight.
Well, I think there is lots of evidence that there was a psychological transformation affected by the plague and by the sudden dramatic disappearance of so many people.
Death clings to their imaginations like a menacing shadow and creeps into the late medieval art known as danse macabre.
The kind of Dutch paintings you see with skeletons dancing and with a kind of memento mori, just remember death. Death is everywhere.
In time, the social upheaval of the post-plague years, the questioning attitudes and increased individualism all lead to the greatest flowering of culture and knowledge in European history. The Renaissance. The Renaissance in Italy shows the extraordinary resilience of human society, a tenacity and creative energy that sustained it through the plague's darkest years.
It was as if Europe had suddenly switched off and then back on again. And the Black Death had done that.
But today, many scientists wonder how well modern society would emerge from a similar cataclysm. For killer microbes still exist in remote regions, waiting for a host to take them to our modern population centers. Between 1347 and 1350, nearly half of the population of the known world perishes. Nothing before or since. No earthquake, no war, no weapon of mass destruction has ever caused such mortality.
The ultimate enemy are microbes. And man has no reason to think that because of his super intellect, if it really came down to a battle, he would necessarily win.
Surprisingly, the microbe that causes bubonic plague still exists in our world today. In Saudi Arabia, North and South Africa, parts of South America, and the United States. In 1900, the microbe hitches a ride from its perennial breeding grounds in China aboard merchant ships to California, spawning an outbreak of bubonic plague in the United States. From the west coast, it travels inland, where it finds a fertile new host population, the rodent communities of America's deserts and grasslands.
It's in the southwestern part of the United States, Colorado, New Mexico, Utah, California, some in Texas, Arizona. It's mainly in ground squirrels, chipmunks, prairie dogs, small rodent animals. It can infect other animals, particularly cats.
Cats, like humans, are very, very susceptible to plague, and they can develop plague pneumonia with cough. And they can spread the disease then to people. If the pet owner is handling the cat, has the cat up in their face, and the cat's coughing, they can get what we call primary pneumonic plague, which is acquired by inhaling the bacteria.